Good afternoon. I am starting 21, causation. Why things happen. Why? Because. Causation, cause and effect. That's the topic for the day. And I would argue that this is worth studying in your life. It's worth thinking about in your life, not just thinking about because some guy at a university made you do a research project, or two people, me and Frank or me and Maria, made you do a research project. It's why does stuff happen? Why do people do what they do? Why do individuals do what they do? Why do groups do what they do? That's worth thinking about. So, and just reading in your classes. When you read anything outside of the core, like you're taking 270, 271, 275, 300, yeah. You're taking all these other sociology classes and women's studies and anthropology and history and political science and why is the world the way it is? Asking why is important. You don't always have to answer it, but it's worth thinking about. Okay, causation and epistemological paradigms. There's two basic ways to think about causation. They're very different, and I hope I can make sense of them for you. The key problem is explaining what I mean by probabilistic, or what we all mean by probabilistic versus deterministic. I think I've done a good job planning that. We'll see. So, positivist approach to causation. It's said in the readings that still looking for laws of society. Not really. Pretty much everyone understands what the sociologist Robert Merton said in the 1950s. There's not really any such thing as laws of society. And if there are any, they're pretty trivial. But there are consistencies, let's say, under certain conditions. So if you have conditions A, certain things happen. Conditions B, other things tend to happen. And so that's why he called them middle range theories or law-like theories. They're kind of like laws, but not really. So they're not like the law of gravity. A law means it always happens 100% of the time. Law of thermodynamics always happens. We can bet on it. There's no such thing in society, but some tendencies, some consistencies get pretty close. And likewise, it bugged me that they mentioned the covering law. That's sort of the covering law model. There's a type of law that covers the particular events you want to explain. That law links your events with other events. Again, this is laws of society thinking, and sociologists don't really think this way anymore. So I'm a little frustrated that people keep talking about covering laws, but I wouldn't worry too much about it. It was in one of the readings, just let it go. But let's move on to the next part, which is more important, quantitative research. So the approach to maybe not laws, but tendencies or consistencies leads to quantitative research. You look for a common influence on many cases. Okay, let's think this through. If you're looking for a tendency, you need a lot of cases. I mean, think about it this way. If you shake hands with someone who has COVID-19, what's your chance of getting it? So if you get it 10% of the time, that's not really a tendency. 10%, that's pretty small. 40% of the time, it's going to make you more nervous, but in terms of purely neutral mental thinking, 40% is kind of sort of a tendency. 70%, you shake hands with somebody who you know has COVID-19, 70% of the time, you get it. Okay, that's a tendency. We'd probably use the word likely for 70%. 90% of the time, 10% of the time you don't, 90% of the time you do. We'd call that probable. You're probably going to get it. If we have tested people over and over and over, we've got hundreds and hundreds of contacts, and we've set them up on purpose, which, by the way, ethics is on Wednesday, and that would totally violate ethics. Well, no, they're doing clinical trials, right now, so maybe it wouldn't, especially when people are desperate. We'll get to that. But if you find from the data that 90% of the time we know this person has COVID-19, you shake hands with them, you get COVID-19, that's probable, but it's not 100%. Probable is not the same as going to, definitely going to happen. But do you see the point that if you want to know the probability, you need a lot of cases? I mean, at the very least, you need 100 cases, because then you can say 90%, 90 out of 100. I mean, you can do the math if you have 50 cases, but you'd ideally want hundreds or thousands of cases to know for sure. But that means you're doing a quantitative study. And I'm using the word probable on purpose. The explanation is probabilistic. It's not deterministic. Deterministic would be you shake hands with somebody 100% of the time, you're going to get it. They have it, you're going to get it. And the explanation is generalizable. So it isn't just our cases. We know for sure it's we can generalize beyond those cases, from the sample to the population. If you get 3,000 Americans who run this experiment, and I think it's 2,700 get it, okay, that's 90%, then you can probably tell every American that's what's going to happen. And you can probably tell the Canadians and the Germans and the Chinese and not the Japanese because they're not shaking hands, they're bowing. And they originally think that, in fact, bowing came from hygienic practices, which, what's his face? This is a digression, but I finally feel the need for digression. Anthony Fauci, the lead guy for the U.S. government, has said, I hope we never shake hands again. What are we going to do then? Bump elbows? We're not going to high five. He doesn't want us to shake hands. He doesn't want us to touch hands. Bow? Are we all going to be Japanese, at least in terms of bowing? I don't know. But you get the idea. The explanation is probabilistic. And it's also worth knowing that the language matters. So we say cause or influence, or if we're going to be formal about it, independent variable. And we say effect or outcome, or being formal, dependent variable. So you can use cause or influence or independent variable. And you can use effect or outcome or a dependent variable. This is worth thinking about. It's called a dependent variable because the effect depends upon the cause. Shaking hands with somebody, having it on their hands, causes you to get it. Another example would be, are you going to raise your income when you go to college and you graduate? No, we can't guarantee it. It's not determined. It's not deterministic. It's probabilistic. There's a lot of ways, first of all, for you to screw that up. You get a college degree and then you blow it in other ways. But also, there's lots of ways for society to screw it up for you. For life, just, car accidents and parents doing weird stuff and you get sick. And I mean, that's just life. That happens to everybody. Then there's society screwing it up for you. Gender and race and class mean you do all the right things and it still doesn't pay off. That's also possible. But the research does show an individual getting a college degree is very likely, is probably going to see an increase in income over their life. And in terms of that individual, you'd have to get the education first. And the income then is second. The income is at least partly dependent on your education. Finally, it's worth just thinking, if we're doing positivist thinking. If you can't state a counter hypothesis, if you can't falsify a hypothesis, then you can't test it. So a counter hypothesis would be that education has zero effect on income. That is a counter hypothesis. The other approach, and again, it's Ideographic and constructionist is an approach within ideographic research. Just never, ever entertained the idea of laws of society. Human culture, human thought, collective thought, individual intentionality always leads to a unique set of experiences, a unique set of conditions. Ideographic researchers are the opposite of nomothetic positivist researchers. And constructionists are one type of ideographic researchers. So an example in psychology would be studying life events and life course so that we can explain why individuals are individuals. I mean, you're an individual. You have all these social characteristics. You're black or you're white or male or female or you're trans or cis or all sorts of labels that we put on you, but you're still you. You are an individual. Even identical twins. I know two identical twins. They are twins of each other. They're librarians at Milner Library, and it's taken a few years for me to realize how they're different, and now I can spot them in like 2 or 3 seconds. Oh yeah, that's Jean. Oh no, that's her sister, Maureen. I know now. So they are different, but they are mostly the same person. But you know what? There's enough of a difference. They are two individuals. That's a very ideographic way of thinking, looking at uniqueness of individuals. Sociologists, not psychologists, sociologists would look at groups, situations, unique sequences of events. And that's, again, still an ideographic approach. So the context, the set of initial conditions, is all important to an ideographic researcher and especially to a constructionist, because you could be a materialist ideographic person. You could say, yeah, how people construct things in their head, I don't really care. I don't think that's all that important. But I'm still ideographic. I still think that unique historical circumstances, unique situations develop. A constructionist goes one more step and says it's not just unique material circumstances. This group has more money than that group. This group has more power. It's mental construction of the situation. So those are the results usually of history. Groups and societies at specific times in their course throughout time look certain ways. We don't look like we did in the 1960s. The United States does not look like that. Burkina Faso does not look like what it did in the 1960s. Ecuador doesn't look like what it did in the 1960s. Things are different now. So that's the background for what you're trying to explain. And a constructionist would say, okay, there are these social relationships, these group relationships in the United States in the 1960s. Things have changed dramatically. A constructionist would add, this is how groups think about things. So this it always suggests qualitative thinking, often suggests narrative thinking, thinking in a story, thinking about sequences, thinking in terms of this happened, then this happened, then this happened. And that's why you get a very typical constructionist explanation is you're starting with the context, also known as initial conditions. And then you talk about a concrete series of a sequence of events that lead to this unique outcome. That's why the explanation is particularistic, because you're looking at the particular sequence of actual events. It's also deterministic because there's no probability about it. It was going to happen or it wasn't going to happen, one or the other. That's why we mean it's determined. The cause determined the following effect, and that effect became a cause for other effects. It's not really generalizable. Like, you're just looking at this particular thing. Here's an example. And this will prefigure what I'm going to get to in a minute. we may need a quantitative analysis of why Donald Trump won the presidency in 2016. And there have been plenty of such analyses. But then once he's in office, that leads to a particular set of events. He does things and people respond a certain way, and history follows a particular path. Let's say Hillary Clinton had won the 2016 election. Somehow she squeaked it out and he lost, and a different concrete specific set of events would have happened. She would have taken the oath of office, and then she would have had different relations with Congress, and different people would be appointed to the Supreme Court, and the women's marches wouldn't have happened. Do you see what I mean? That's the sort of thinking that ideographic researchers use and in order to understand causes and effects. And it's very particularistic. Some scholars don't even do any of that. I have talked about my friend and former colleague Virginia Gill. She retired, and I miss having her in our department. She is great, and she doesn't miss it at all. She is very glad to be retired. 4 hours a day. She works on her research. Yeah, she's continuing her research. She loves doing it. 4 hours a day, she hangs out with her husband. He's retired too. They're both great people. Can you tell I'm also envious? In some ways, no, because I would miss teaching. I miss you guys right now. The reason I bring up Virginia Gill, even though I went on a tangent, is that Virginia is one of those people in number 6. They study what and how. They don't study why. And in fact, she's the one who told me about this. She said, in conversation analysis, which is a form of very, very micro social interaction, one person to another, maybe two people with one person, you look at how people create society, recreate society, moment to moment, by following a script, by relying on pre-existing ideas to say things to each other, conversation. And that recreates society moment by moment, person by person, interaction by interaction. Not so much concerned about why. So most researchers in the social sciences are concerned about why, but it's worth knowing about this subset that isn't concerned with it. They want to know how. And that's a legitimate approach to how social life works. Okay, here we start on a long section. The counterfactual. What happens without the influence of the independent variable? This is a way to think through causation, and it's a way to help you set up research. Remember, we're in research design. We're setting up research. Counterfactual thinking it underlies a lot of research design. Most explicitly experimental design, but quantitative design and positivistic design, deductive nomothetic design in general, it underlies that thinking. It's really useful. Not always, but in a lot of cases, it's really useful. And I'll explain what a counterfactual is. I talked about this earlier. Counterfactual thinking is the killing baby Hitler. That never happened. It's not a fact. He did get born. He did grow up. He did lead Germany off a cliff, kill how many millions of people, had lots of help doing it. Would it make a difference if you got in a time machine, went back to 1882, kidnapped this poor little baby, did whatever horrible thing you have to do to kill a baby, and then you follow history again and see if it made a difference in Germany and the rest of the world? That's counterfactual thinking, that thought experiment. It's counter to fact. It's against fact. It didn't happen. It's not a fact. So, if it didn't exist, if the cause that you have observed in the world didn't exist, other causes would have operated and different effects would have resulted. That's the basic thinking behind counterfactual approaches. The problem, and this is crucial, absolutely crucial, you can't run history twice. We don't have time machines. That's nuts. So Since you can't, we have to do what's called estimating the counterfactual, which approximates running history twice. So I'm going to show you a series of diagrams um, to lead you through what is called a thought experiment. Okay, here's the start. T1, time one, timeline one, history happens. Here we are, big deal. My example, which is probably a pretty terrible one, I'm teaching Sociology 271, Section 1. And to make this even messier, we're back in the classroom. And I use these diagrams, and I test you about causation, okay? I teach with these diagrams. I teach you about causation with these diagrams. Have you take a test about causation. Then I get in my time machine, and I go back. And just before I teach causation with these diagrams, I go stop myself, and I remember that I'm going to come and go stop myself because I've set this up. And I don't use these diagrams. I create a different timeline by going back in time, telling myself, okay, stop, don't do that. And it's with the exact same people. So section 1, Norris and Bonnie and Mia and Tia and Kevin. And I'm sorry, a few other students. I think there were 9 enrolled in section 1. So it's the exact same people. It is not people like Norris or Bonnie or Mia. It's those students themselves. We test you guys on timeline 2. I teach without these diagrams. I test you. And my guess would be, if these diagrams work, you don't understand causation as well. Only one thing has changed. I teach it without these diagrams. Otherwise, everything I say is identical. How we pull that off, the hell if I know. This is the only way to know for sure what effect the causal intervention actually had. This is the only possible way to know what causes what, is to run history twice with all the same people, all the same circumstances, all the same everything, with one change. That's how we know for sure. That is our epistemological lock. We know. That's nuts. Time machines. Sorry, there's no evidence for them. And every semester I say, well, this is crazy talk and time machines don't exist. And students go, how do you know that? Well, I don't. But you know what? There's no evidence for it. Here's the thing. We want to know what causes what. We are researching cause and effect. What do we do since we don't have time machines? We estimate what would have happened. We find a group or a situation or an event that is similar enough. So I'm not using those exact students. I use these diagrams in section 1 and I don't use them in section 2. And I make that causal intervention. I don't use those diagrams in section 2. And it's only an estimate because Michael is not Kevin or Norris. Michael is somebody else. Lexi and Katie and Misty and Sabrina are not the people in section 1. They're different human beings. We're getting close, but it's only an estimate. So the second timeline, or section 2, is a fictional timeline in the sense that the two groups are not the same. The people I've just mentioned, Sabrina and Misty and others, are not fictional people. You live. But in terms of being stand-ins for Mia and Tia and Kevin, you are fictional. You're not perfect stand-ins. You're estimates. You're not identical to each other. The hope is you're close enough. Okay, this is why random sampling is so crucial. So I'm just going to read this, but I'm going to throw in comments. If the two groups are identical in all relevant respects, we can estimate a really good counterfactual. Well, identical in all relevant respects. There's that word again, relevant. How do we know what's relevant? If we had sociology majors at the U of I and had 2 sections, and we had sociology majors at other departments at Wesleyan and Millikan and Bradley and U of I Chicago and on and on and on, and we kept running this experiment. After a while, we'd probably get close enough in terms of being identical in all relevant respects, and then we could conclude something about causation. Again, the book says, physical objects, animals, are they close enough? Well, physicists and biologists say, yeah, pretty much. Humans, well, that's the problem. All constructionist researchers are committed to the idea that everything is unique. And so that's another reason why so many researchers in the positivist approach research causation. They're trying to come up with general principles so they treat people as identical overall. Yeah, it drives constructionists nuts. Identical enough, we don't really buy it. And the positivists say, yeah, close enough, identical enough. We'll learn something. So if you are a positivist, you have 5 criteria for establishing causation. And here are all 5 on this one page, and I'm going to go through them all. But first, I strongly urge you to go to Tyler Vigen Spurious Correlations, the website right here. Pause this. Just put it on pause and go to type it in. Sorry, I don't have a way to link to that website. I am not that YouTube savvy. You're just going to have to type it in bit by bit, though. Maybe I can send you an email with this. You know what? I'll put it in the forum. But if you go to this, you'll see, for instance, the very first one is U.S. spending on science, space, and technology is highly correlated over a certain stretch of years by suicides by hanging, strangulation, and suffocation. What? U.S. science and space and technology spending is correlated with suicide by not breathing? That's really, really weird. Like, what the hell? It's ridiculous. That's the point of the website. He gives you all of these correlations that don't make any sense. Like, how can U.S. spending on these things kill people by suicide? That just makes no sense. And that's his point. It's very easy to say 2 things relate together, correlate. They co-vary, they change together. One goes up, the other goes up. One goes down, the other goes down. That's what a correlation is. It's so easy to say these 2 things correlate, and therefore they cause. One causes the other. Well, no, not always. However, what I've got underlined here in A is really important. If they don't correlate, then you can't say that there's one causes the other. That's a minimum. In other words, the whole thing, correlation does not equal causation, means you need correlation and you need 4 more criteria. You need to meet 4 more criteria. Okay, time order. This one is painfully obvious, but we need to say it. The cause must be before the effect. And this is what makes these cross-sectional studies so tentative. Longitudinal studies are better at proving causation. But you need to have it. You know, the effect can't lead to a cause. The cause has to lead to the effect. This helps get rid of spurious, false conclusions about correlations. That's what spurious means. You've got a correlation and you've concluded something false about it because they vary together. The third one is my favorite. The reading puts it non-spurious correlation. I think that's confusing. When I read it, I thought it was confusing. I had to think it through. What it really means is there's no omitted variables. So the classic is sunburns go up in the summer and ice cream sales go up in the summer. And if you buy ice cream, you're going to get sunburn. If you get a sunburn, you're going to buy ice cream. That's a little more plausible. You get a sunburn. You want some sort of comfort, and maybe you're messy and don't care, and you slather ice cream all over your body, which is a very short-term thing because it's going to melt. But it's a little bit more plausible, but basically neither one is plausible at all. And the obvious thing is, duh, it's hotter. So you buy more ice cream, and when you're out in the sun, you get sunburn more. That's what an omitted variable would be. The sun's out more. It's hotter. You're outside more. Therefore, these two things which correlate, sunburns and ice cream use, both go up. But that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to find variables that are really leading. If you omit a variable, if you skip a variable, if you ignore it or don't know it exists, then you're going to come to a false conclusion about the correlation. That's what an omitted variable is. It's left out somehow. You don't know it exists, or you've disregarded it on purpose, one or the other. Case studies, I will get to this, are great for making sure you don't omit variables. We'll get to that. The fourth one is in qualitative research, it's called causal mechanism. In quantitative research, it's called the intervening variable. Either way, it's the specific process that makes the cause lead to the effect. And a classic one is great. It's smoking and lung cancer or emphysema. So for years, the U.S. Surgeon General's office, various organs of the U.S. government had done research on cigarette smoking. And in 1964, they finally said, cigarette smoking causes lung cancer. Cigarette smoking causes emphysema. Cigarette smoking causes heart disease. And the cigarette companies went apeshit and said, that's not true. And the problem with the Surgeon General was that the cigarette companies had a point. They didn't say why it happened. Why does putting smoke into your lungs do that? Well, over the years, they found what are called causal mechanisms. The smoke gets into your lungs, and you breathe in less oxygen. You breathe in less oxygen, your heart works harder. Over time, it damages your heart. That's the specific process causing the heart damage. Or the smoke gets into your lungs and it damages your cells in your lungs, which means over time, you can't take the oxygen out of the air. Your lungs can't do it anymore. It's cell damage that is the causal mechanism. Cell damage that is the intervening variable. So, that would be a very materialistic example, but I'm trying to give you that sort of example so you get it, so you can understand it. And then let's apply it to society. So why do people do what they do? Well, a good example. Why did the U.S. bicycle market collapse in 5 years? And maybe you could say in 12 years. It just tanked. Suddenly people weren't riding, people weren't buying, all of that. You saw the numbers in the previous day, the bike shops per 10,000 in those 4 cities. And I triangulated, other evidence shows the same thing. Multiple lines of evidence show exactly the same thing. Why? I thought I identified the specific causal mechanism, that it was class. But stopping there, social class, but it was stopping there was not enough. And I compared. This is why France was so useful. The ethno-racial situation between classes in France was that they were pretty similar, that there were just no cultural or racial differences between the upper classes and the middle classes and the lower classes in these various regions in France. They were very minor. There were differences, but they were minor. And anybody who studies class culture will say, oh, come on, there's differences in class cultures. True, but there was a lot of, like the upper working class and the lower middle class, they were quite often the same. And then the lower class and the middle class, they shared a lot too. Excuse me. There weren't a lot of differences. In the United States, that was very different. Middle class people were almost always Anglo. Their ancestors were from England. They had names like Smith and Jones. And there was this huge tidal wave of immigrants from Bohemia and other parts of Central Europe and Poland and Germany and Russia. And they were Jewish and they were Italian. And they filled the factories and they filled the tenements. They were poor. They were working class. And so the cultural differences in the United States between classes were vast. In the South, you had ex-slaves and their children and their grandchildren. They were black, and even poor whites, but certainly middle-class whites were, white. So when bicycle prices dropped, and suddenly black people in the South and Jewish people and Catholics, Italians, Central Europeans, Poles, were able to afford bicycles, the middle classes went bah and stopped. That's, I know they didn't actually go bah, but they kind of freaked out on the inside. And that is the causal mechanism. See, I ultimately got there. They psychologically didn't want to be associated with different groups. They wanted to stay associated with their own group, and their own practices were going to be a certain way. Other groups took their practices, fine, we'll stop practicing that. We'll stop writing. That's my explanation. I don't know if that's true. I think it's true. I'm pretty sure it's true. I can't guarantee it's true. But that's the causal mechanism that each individual, and they were all convincing each other too. It was just passe. It was just, oh, those people have started doing it, so we're going to stop. It's a very social psychological mechanism. It occurs inside people, but over and over and over and over, and they're convincing each other to make this internal decision. That's what I mean by a causal mechanism, and that's one reason that I say that studying causation is useful in life. You don't know what's going on in people's heads. You don't know why people do what they do. If you study them carefully long enough, maybe you can figure it out. And if you know why they do what they do, maybe you can change what they do. Context, the conditions in which the causal mechanism operates. That's what I was driving at, that the context in the United States and the context in France were very different. COVID-19, different societies are having very different experiences of mortality, of death rates. They are having much higher death rates than, say, Italy. If we use Italy was the first and the worst, but it turns out it's not the worst. Spain is worse. If you look at a deaths per person, Spain is having a terrible time. You look at Germany and Canada, they're not nearly as bad. And the United States, not nearly as bad. These societies are different. The context makes a difference. Validity. All right, how do we know whether we are actually understanding reality? That's the question about validity. Do we really, what's happening out there in the world? Is that what our models, our research, our findings are telling us? Or are we making some story up that's wrong? Do we understand the world? Really? Do we? That's the question of validity. Internal validity. There are two types. Internal validity. Do we actually understand what causes what? We've spent time really working through these 5 criteria and checking off and doing our best. And yeah, we think we really got a handle on what causes what. External validity is, okay, if we figured out what causes what, does it explain other groups? So 2 types of external validity are from the sample to the population, and then from one population to another. And a really good example of this is men dying. Okay, technically males. The mortality rate for Chinese males was always higher than it was for Chinese females when this originated in December and January. And the first explanation was, Chinese men smoke like chimneys. 52% of Chinese men smoke cigarettes. 2 or 3% of Chinese women smoke cigarettes. Well, that must be it. Well, this thing spread. The Chinese screwed up, let it go beyond their borders. Now the rest of the world has it, and it's absolutely, by the way, digression, it's going to devastate developing countries, the global south. It's going to be bad. Death rates will be higher. Their hospital capabilities are not as high, and their medicine is not as good. They don't have the money. It's going to be bad. So the Chinese have a lot to answer for. So it gets to Europe. It gets to the United States. It gets to Canada. Lo and behold, men die more than women. Now it's still, 1.5% of women who get it die, and 3% of men who get it die, or if you want to be technical, males and females. The research, if we could study trans people who got it and died or didn't, that might be really useful. Like, is it hormones? Is it hormonal? Because there are trans people who do not transition, and there are people who do. And a complete transition involves genital surgery, and it involves taking hormones for the rest of your life. Take estrogen and breasts grow. Take hormones and you get a beard and your voice lowers. Testosterone, I'm sorry. And would it be hormones? I mean, a lot of constructionists and the social sciences, it's not hormones. But, the biologists would say, yeah, it could be. Is it DNA? Is that why? You've got XX versus XY, or is it hormones, or what is it? So, in any case, it turned out that the explanation that Chinese men smoked had pretty bad internal validity, because the finding that males die more than females in this generalized pretty well. It generalized around the world. So case studies help us with both kinds of validity. They mostly internal validity. Usually, as I've said before, and I'm going to repeat it, they reveal previously unknown causes. This is a great if you go back to the criterion number 3, omitted variable bias or omitted variable problems. You omit fewer variables. You become aware when you do a case study of all the possible causes or more possible causes. Previously unknown causes become known. You improve your internal validity. And then they help identify the specific causal mechanisms. That's what case studies can do in terms of validity in causation. So now you understand why I argued that causation is worth studying in life, not just in research. If you think all these through together, just thinking about your friends and your family and your relationships, your significant other, and people in society. Why do people do what they do? When you read sociology, you can start thinking more carefully about why people do what they do.